when I talk, but I have a couple quotes that I want to talk about, because mainly what I wanted to talk about was the context of how these architects worked and where Aubrey St. Clair worked within the realm of the contextual history of California, and sort of kind of do the very succinct version of that, because I'll happily speak louder. Normally, I talk way too loud. So I'm more than happy to talk like I normally speak. That's perfect. But one of the things that's most important to me, particularly about my kind of long history within architecture of Southern California, because I was president of the Society of Architectural Historians for Southern California for a decade, and one of the things is the contextual aspect of it. And so one of the things I know we as historians, some historians try to do, is put this romantic overlay everything, and that I understand that exists, and I get it, I see where that's coming from, but that's not really where I come from. It is where I try to put a realistic expectation on it, because I think that helps us most today in understanding where we might be headed and where we can possibly head. So when we look at the architectural style that, let's say, Aubrey St. Clair worked in, which was a historic revival style, part of that was really rooted in the first, after when the United States celebrated its 100-year history in 1876, there was kind of this rebirth among architects to look back into American history and decide, well, that's where we wanted to get some eclectic kind of revival styles. And again, and that happened in 1893 at the Chicago Exposition, the World's Fair. There was that continual rebirth in taking these styles that weren't just then looking only to Europe, but were also looking toward what happened in the United States. So you ended up with things like this Normandy style of architecture, which became very popular in Laguna in the 20s. And part of the reason for that was that people had come back from Europe returning after World War I, and had this romantic kind of overlay that they wanted to put into it, and thought, well, here's some history that we can look back on and sort of recreate, because there's nothing better than a soldier coming back from World War I and saying, oh, well, I was in there fighting a war, but we spent a lot of time in the countryside, and I saw these beautiful farmhouses, that the massing on them was beautiful, and the detailing, and I want to bring some of that to help make some place like Laguna have a wonderfully romantic overlay that's appealing. And so at the time, to have to compete against, if you think about it, the same time Aubrey was working on these style of buildings, you had something like the Barcelona Pavilion being built, where it's this very strict glass, modern, flat-roofed building that we see as very, very modernistic. So you had this kind of contrast happening in society and culture, which I find fascinating that was going on, because where is the benefit from a social cultural standpoint for what was happening in areas like Laguna and Carmel and other parts of Los Angeles, and what was happening in the more international style modernism? That those were concurrent, I find fascinating when we look at it that way, not to isolate them, because Aubrey could have easily built in any style that he chose to build in, but he had a particular preference for an eclectic romantic revival style that was obviously very popular and handled very, very well. So that's why I want to look at some of these, which is why I brought some quotes, because those kinds of things to me are somewhat interesting about what was happening culturally. And so, in 1946, there's a historian, Carey McWilliams, who was really, really well known and did a bunch of great history on California, but how he looked at California, particularly how Laguna was developed. Because, it's like, why would people come here when there wasn't really even a road to get here? The only way to get down here was through the canyon. And so why would people try to escape from what may have been happening in Los Angeles at that time? So it was great how Carey described it in 46 looking back, because he says what the gold rush had been to Northern California, the real estate, oil, and motion picture boom was to Southern California. And for the St. Clair family to be involved in that in the motion picture industry is fascinating. The great boom of the 1880s had been spectacular, but it had been limited to land speculation. The boom of the 20s, which was when Laguna really, really took off, on the other hand, was a truly bonanza affair. Millions of dollars in new income poured into the Los Angeles area in Southern California, undermining the social structure of the community, warping and twisting its institutions, and ending in a debacle, the stock market crash. For Southern California, the decade was one long drunken orgy, one protracted debauch, which I love that kind of look back on it. And one of the things that I've always found most interesting about Laguna, if you compare it to Carmel, which is because the Bohemian cultures in both cities, or both villages, were doing something very similar at the time, was, frankly, what happened in Carmel was the U.S. government started buying up property toward the end of the 1930s, and by 1939, the government started releasing things that the socialists that were in Carmel, which were artists and writers and actors and painters that had escaped there from Los Angeles and San Francisco, needed to get out because they were building new military installations in preparation of World War II. But in Laguna, there was that fortunate benefit in that it really was more isolated, and it wasn't this kind of centralized location. So Laguna was then able to carry forward that social cultural aspect, obviously, through the 50s and 60s and 70s, and even through to today, where there were many communities in California where Bohemians went to that were not able to really continue that. And that's one of the great social benefits of Laguna when we look at it from a history standpoint, and why its architecture fitting within that mold is so important to us as historians, and why that level of expertise and what we try to learn from everybody here is really important in cultural history of California. At the same time that Laguna was kind of booming, because in the 20s it was a pretty popular place for vacations and second homes, and part of that was because you were able to kind of escape from what was becoming ultimately more conservative in portions of Los Angeles, is that more than 100,000 people were streaming annually into Southern California at that time, which was the largest migration in the country ever that had ever happened. So annually, you had a lot of people coming to Southern California. And as a writer described it then, everything from a gentle transplanting of genteel bourgeoisie to a swarm of invading locusts, which I think that's really, really great. But the idea of what was Laguna doing at that time, and here we start linking in with what Aubrey was doing, because as you might know, he not only built for building the water district in Pasadena, but he also built for the water district here in Laguna. And what's another good model of that is what people in Laguna Beach were doing was kind of mimicking what was being done on a much larger scale, business-wise, in Los Angeles. And so here you had guys, and this is not uncommon knowledge. I mean, you can even find it on the Water District's website. But, these guys decided they needed to get water to Laguna because that was a huge problem. And so what did they do? They formed a duck club and called themselves duck hunters and went to Huntington Beach and bought up a duck area of water where they could have their hunt club. That was in 1925. And then they came back to Laguna and then asked the voters that, well, we'll need to get some water here. And everybody in town voted. It was 437-0 that they needed to get the water. So then they built a pipeline that opened up in 1927, 13 miles from Huntington Beach to Laguna to bring their water here. And what's fascinating is that as a model is almost identical to what William Mulholland did in Los Angeles. He did it on a much larger scale, but exactly the same idea, going to the Owens Valley and then bringing the pipeline here, and then eventually at the time that Laguna was running to Huntington Beach and building a pipeline, then the water district in Los Angeles was actually moving to the Colorado River, and the same year built a pipeline from there to supply the water to Los Angeles. So this modeling that goes on of these kind of big businessmen, which of course were very big businessmen in the Los Angeles area, you had the kind of smaller businessmen here that came here for a variety of reasons. Some came because they were less successful in the larger cities. Others came because they had more freedom if they were here, kind of tucked into this island surrounded by the hills, that they could then succeed in the way that they weren't able to succeed in a city like Los Angeles. And that history of Laguna is quite critical and important. And that's one of the things to me that makes the area quite fascinating in a contextual standpoint for the entire 20th century. So as it said in the 1925 newspaper article, the booms and busts and how that was kind of changing the character of the area, and Laguna was reflecting that on a scale that, to me, is somewhat approachable and understandable to us. It's very difficult to relate to somebody directly like William Mulholland, who who was really out there for personal gain. But the people that came to Laguna, even though they were doing some of the same things, there was something slightly more personal about it. It wasn't nearly on the scale that it was happening elsewhere in Southern California. But as the article said, the people on top in Southern California are the big men, the businessmen, described as the high priests of the religion of climate and profits. They are the promoters who are blowing down the region's windpipe with all their might, hoping to inflate the place to a size that will be reckoned the largest city in the country. And trailing after the big boys is a mob of lesser fellows. And this is where Laguna starts to fit into this. Thousands of minor realtors, boomers, promoters, contractors, agents, salesmen, bunco men, office holders, lawyers, and preachers, all driven by the same motives of wealth, power, and personal glory. Then there are the folks. They are the retired farmers, grocers, Ford agents, hardware merchants, and shoe merchants, which is really fascinating because if you look at the history of the businesses along Forest Avenue in 1925, it was all that. All those businesses were there. Those people from the Middle West or wherever they used to live, and now they are here in California, sunny California, to rest and regain their vigor, enjoy the climate, look at pretty scenery, live in little bungalows with a palm tree or banana plant in front, and eat in cafeterias. And perhaps strike it rich. And so for that information to come out right in the midst of all this in 1925 and be published is a fascinating direct historical context to what really made Laguna survive, starting at that time and continuing to today. So that within a context is what is most interesting to me related to Aubrey's work and how it fits within all of Southern California, because even if you look at the massing of what Aubrey was doing, for example, if you look at that relative to Chris Abel's work, even, it's almost the same type of massing with an off-centered gable that's light on one side and steeply sloped on the other. So when you start looking at it historically, you can see where that historic influence then moved into more modern design, that we don't necessarily make that connection 40 years after and 50 years after when that other type work was being done. Because even Lamont Langworthy, you can see a very similar style massing, even though we're not always making that direct connection between what was happening back in the 20s and then what some of these other architects were doing in the 60s and 70s. So that part's great. I'm happy to be here. This is the first time I've been in this house. I've driven by this house for decades, and it's great to be in here and experience it. So thank you very much.